There we go. Okay. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to ShowMeCon. I'm really excited to be back here. This is a really awesome con. I travel all over the world, and this is one of my favorites. So if this is your first con, congratulations. So today we're going to talk about building software more securely. Today we have a problem where developers and other people who are not security really don't care about security. We are relying on pen testing and offensive testing after the fact to try to figure out where the flaws are, try to figure out where the bugs are, rather than spending time up front building it securely. So what that ends up with is a bunch of software that is existing out there in production that really just had security tacked on at the end. This is a problem because it creates risk. It creates extra cost for the business. It makes it so that software developers are not doing things that actually make money, like adding new features. So they're fixing things. So one of the biggest problems that we have is that developers are not taught about security if they're taught in schools, let's say in curriculums. They're not taught when they're self-taught either, generally, because they're not being graded on security. They're not being told that things need to be correct and on time and within budget and all these other things. The software needs to compile. It needs to work. They don't care if it's secure. They're not being graded on that. They might take like one security class in their entire 4 years of software engineering. That's a big problem. So let's talk about the stakeholders. There are lots of stakeholders besides us. We tend to think very centrally about security, and we think that, we're the most important thing, but every stakeholder that's out there has a different they come to the table with different requirements. They come with different needs. They come with goals that are very different from us. They can either be partners with us, or they can stop us in our tracks, and they can actively fight against us, which I've definitely had to deal with, and you probably have too. Not just passively fighting against you, but like actively just trying to keep you from keeping things secure. So if we think about how software should be, if we think about that goal, that end state, and we're not talking about compliance. Compliance is not an end state. It's just proving that something is secure. So if we think about what software should look like, then we can tell what the difference is between how it is and how it exists today, and that's a gap analysis. So if we think about the processes that get us to that place, we understand that processes are not the same as the people. We understand that processes are what is building software. The people are building software, but they're following processes. So when we understand those processes, we can make change within them, and we can make better software. People resist change. There's a number of reasons. It actually feels painful to us. The region in the brain that feels pain is activated when change happens because of uncertainty. It's very uncomfortable. So computers don't resist change, processes don't resist change, people do. And when we understand that, then we can start to realize what's happening and why software is really being made insecurely. So if we take a look at historical data about why we got to where we are. Let's look at the artifacts. Let's look at the diagrams. Let's look at the processes for developing software. Are people asking for software by Tuesday, or are they asking for good software? And it's probably the first one. So we can look at how things are being done. We can look at how people interact. And we can ask people like, well, what do you think is the biggest problem? Or what do you think, how do you think we could do better? And that's where inquiry comes in. So when we talk about the stakeholders, there's a number of different people involved in software. This is a list of them. Some of them we tend to interact with a little bit more than others. Let's say the operators. So once we go into production, we're dealing with operators that are patching systems, they're They're looking for problems. They're the ones that are digging through logs and finding things. The auditors we're also dealing with a lot because they come in and we have to prove that we're doing everything that we say that we're doing. But the customers we may not be interacting with so much. The developers themselves we may not be interacting with so much. It may be their managers, or it may be a project manager or somebody that's working with them more closely, and we're being funneled in because they like to keep this wall between security and development. I don't know why. It's terrible. So the stakeholders really do have different points of view. The builders want it to be on time, quick. They want to make a profit. And when I say builders, I'm talking about developers. I'm talking about software architects, software engineers, DevOps, the people that are actually making the software. So they want it to be correct. They want it to have as few bugs as possible, and they want it to be optimized. But we have very different goals. We want it to be built securely. We want to maintain it securely. It should be patchable. It should log correctly. And we should be able to prove to the auditors that it's protected. The builders really don't care about any of our goals. They couldn't care less. They have a completely different set of an end state for software. So when we talk about project managers, we should really be embracing the software project managers as much as possible. They are here to help us achieve our goals. They are the quote-unquote supervising adults of the software world, of the business world. They will make things happen for us. They will drive people to do what we want them to do, but we have to tell them what that is. We have to tell them how we want things done. We have to tell them what should be done. So, like I said here, it's a garbage in, garbage out situation. If we don't give them complete requirements for software, we are not going to get software that meets the requirements we want. So we need to think about that. They are only as good as the information that we provide. But they can help us if we use them in the way that they are good at. If we use them to do the things that they're good at, which is to push people and drive processes. With QA and DevOps, this is really where we get into the integration of all of the development and architecture and things that are happening up until production. So there's a lot of automation that should be happening in DevOps. There's a little bit of manual work that DevOps should be doing, but generally it's automation. So this is where we could be utilizing, for example, automated code reviews or automated vulnerability scans. We're not looking so much to DevOps to be doing manual code scans and things like that. That's not really their role. But we should be giving them requirements for testing. If we're not giving them full testing requirements and saying, well, you go in and you check to see that it's actually logging the way that it should be. You go in and we need you to check that you can't escalate privileges within the software. These should be things that can be testable, but we have to provide that information to them or else it won't happen. Legal has very similar interests to us. They care about risk and privacy and compliance, confidentiality, these things that we also care about. They care about deeply. And they have a lot of sway in the business, too. The executives listen to legal. So if we can be on their side and we can become a team with legal where we're going up the chain and we're talking to the executives and we're getting buy-in and we're really like driving into them like this is important that we need to do X, Y, and Z for the software. Legal can help us with that because they don't want that liability. They don't want any risk related to privacy. Especially right now with GDPR and things like that, it becomes extremely important to them that all of these things happen, and we agree. These are important to us. This is important to me as a security practitioner. So the customers, I mean, these are the people, this is why we're here. This is why we have software. If they weren't around, why would we be making software? So their security concerns are generally like more than we think that they are. So we have a certain expectation of what we think that they want, and they have an expectation of what they think that we're providing. And generally, those expectations from the customer are a little higher than they truly are, and we generally underestimate what we think they want. So that's a big problem. We're making assumptions about how they want their data secured and what they're going to be doing with their data once we give them the platform. We need to think closer about what they want. We need to be working with them to figure out what it is that they expect from us. Because if those expectations don't align and we figure that out further down the road, that's a problem. That is not going to keep any trust and goodwill that we have with the customer. And trust is very easy to lose. It's not very easy to gain back. And you start with a certain amount of it, and you can build it, or you can completely wipe it away, and then usually they'll just find another vendor. With third parties, I cannot stress enough how important the supply chain is. We've seen this a lot. We've seen this with, for example, the Target breach. They came in through a third party. Every supply chain has its own supply chain, and that's what makes it a supply chain. They have their own set of suppliers. But why that's important to us is that if the supplier is not as good as or better than our security, then they are a weak link, and they are adding risk to our software, or to the business even. So if we audit them, and we have it in our contracts, and we have it in our policies and things like that, that we audit the third parties, and we do it, hopefully, since we say that we do it, then we should get a better sense of how they are protecting our data. We are the customers, and they don't care as much about security as we do. Like if you're looking at like your trash pickup and your office cleaning and things like that, I mean, they're not probably trained about social engineering. They would probably let somebody into the building who said that they worked there just because they don't understand the risks like we do. So that's creating risk. We should be offering either training to our vendors or having requirements for them that say, you need to meet this level of security or else we're going to go somewhere else. And customers are a huge driver of security in that way because the company will add security if the customer demands it. The vendor will add security if the customer demands it. So when we want to look at how our existing process works, and you're probably not coming into a software development lifecycle where you get to start from the ground up and everything's perfect, and you get to say like, okay, we're going to do security here, 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 and here, and this is how it's going to work. You're probably coming into a lifecycle where they're already creating software, they've already created software, and we have to come in and figure out how to fix that. So that's where we come in and we start observing. We start doing interviews. We're not going to just walk in and make changes like, okay, here suddenly we're doing changes, because nobody's going to accept that. You have to understand the process before we make changes. So we should be looking at who the stakeholders are, who the key players are, who the influencers are, and they may not be the same as the managers, for example. There will be people that are driving processes, and with any change, there's also going to be a winner, and there's probably going to be a loser. So the people that are going to come out as not winning will fight back. So you need to understand who will be affected and how. But really starting to just understand the process is the first step to making change. So we need to find gaps in the process. We should follow it all the way through a couple of iterations of features, a couple of iterations of versions, before we really start to understand. And we then document those gaps so that we can present them to management and say, here are the problems, and then we're going to present fixes. So in that gap analysis, we try to figure out if we have the things in place that security requires for software. So if there's a single point of failure, we're looking at the architecture, we're looking at the design, we're looking at if there's any human element that would cause a delay that could maybe be fixed so that there's a little bit more time for security. We're looking at security milestones. Are they actually meeting the steps that we need? Are they adding things to vulnerability scanning? Are they actually doing code reviews? Things like that. So when we talk about vendors and third parties, we should be asking them also if they are doing their own code reviews, if they're doing software security, because they probably aren't. Most software companies don't care as much about security as they should. So when we do a gap analysis, then we document it. We summarize what's happening. We say, this is the landscape today. This is the process as we've seen it. We've observed it several times. This is how it's working. These are the steps. So then we describe how security fits in various places, or if there's a lack of security, we talk about that. We say, there was no one reviewing the architecture before it moved on to the next step. I mean, that's a huge gap. So we need to document that, we need to list the gaps, and we need to explain the risk. So nobody was reviewing the architecture before they moved on to development. Why is that important? It's important because the architecture could have single points of failure. It could have a lack of a DMZ. It could have any number of things. So we explain what the gap is, we explain the risk, and then we talk about them as we move through the process chronologically. What's more important is to understand how security and adding security into the process will affect the stakeholders. People think that things are okay and they don't need to change. Everything's fine. If I change, my job will be harder. If I change, I will have more work to do. So we want to understand what the roles are, what the goals are of the various stakeholders, kind of like we talked about before. We understand that developers have a time crunch. They want things to work. So if we can understand those and empathize and show them that we understand that those are their goals and we're going to work with them so that they can still be on time and get things out the door, then they will be more amenable to change. When we talk about how security will affect the SDLC process, then we want to document any processes that aren't documented. If we don't have the documented process, we can't look for gaps as easily. We can't fix things that aren't official. If something's not official, then it's not really happening, right? I mean, it could happen any number of ways, but if we want security to be built in, we need to make it official first. So we determine where along the line, in the gaps, should security be injecting input or oversight or approvals. If you move from a design stage to development stage, there should be a checkpoint. There should be a set of things that must be met before security will approve. And if security doesn't approve, software should not be allowed to move on. I know that sounds like really simple, but it doesn't really work that way. So this becomes a maturity model as you go through. You might start with a couple of simple checks. You might start with, okay, does security feel comfortable about moving forward with the software? Is security okay with the design? It may not be perfect, but can we make some concessions that will fix things later or will roadmap changes that we need? This is part of starting the process of getting security in there. It's not going to happen the first time around. Where you try changes, it's not just going to be like suddenly you have secure software. So when you want to rebuild the software development process, it's good to have a plan. And you don't have to necessarily share that with anybody. It can be your own personal plan. You can write it down. You can write down who you think stakeholders are, who you think is important, who you think is going to win, who you think is going to not win. We need to look at where things should be. Do we want a process where software is, has gone through all these checkpoints, where we have documented what was approved at each checkpoint, things like that. Where do we want to be? And how are we going to get there? That's the hard part. Normally I would say that we start looking at the end state and think backwards. So if we know that we want everything to be vulnerability scanned before it goes out the door, then we add that as a checklist item. With metrics, it's really important to have them as things are today before we make change, and then we can compare them as we make the change. If we don't have any metrics, you can't show that you've been effective. You can't show that security is making a difference. We're asking people to spend more time. We're asking people to spend more effort and resources. And if we can't show value, then that's not going to stick. So we have to be able to show comparison between what was and what is going to be, so that we can show over time that there are less security bugs, that there are less regressions, that it's taking less time to move from design to development, for example. Metrics can also help identify gaps. If there is a certain developer that is writing a lot of insecure code or just bad code, like they don't know about what the OWASP top 10 is. So they're writing buffer overflows and cross-site scripting, which is just bad code. Then we can identify who those people are. We can identify the top bad coders, let's say, and we can train them. We can give them extra attention to show them how software should be written and how security works, and why don't you write your own encryption, and why shouldn't you write your own web server, and things like this. We can go to them and we can give them more attention. So we can gamify this as well. We can give rewards to people that are decreasing their security bugs over time. We can reward people publicly. We can reward people with prizes and gifts and raffles and however you want to do it. But when we have these metrics and we're able to attribute certain things to certain people, then it can help explain the return on investment for the time and effort and resources that we've asked for. So some of the important metrics, this is from SANS. We want to show improvements overall to the program, of course, but improvements to availability are things staying up longer. Are we having outages less? Are there reductions in delays to delivery? Is software coming out sooner? Are we getting releases quicker, et cetera? The cost that's associated with time, because we're paying for person hours. The residual risk should also go down, and this is where it comes back to, if you don't have a working risk management program, you are not going to be able to adequately explain how the program is changing and how the program is improving. And that's really just about the threats and that are being that the organization is experiencing, because I mean, every software is being attacked constantly. Every software experiences outages. Every software has to be patched, and these things take time. Okay, so we want to come up with, when we have the gap analysis, we want to come up with 3 phases initially. We'll start with the first phase. These are like low-hanging fruit items. These are things that we can just knock out of the park, and it'll make a big difference. It'll show that change is possible. It'll show that things are happening, and it'll get people used to the idea of security being involved. This is really important. People don't like sudden change. People prefer it when you suggest change, and then you make the change, and then you suggest some more change, and you ease people into change. Nobody wants change thrust upon them, like suddenly security is involved in everything. So phase 2 is going to be some gaps that are a little bit more important, but they really need some time to get there. We need another person. We need to re-architect something. We need to change something a little bit more significant, or we need to change something in phase 1 so that something in phase 2 can be changed. Phase 3 is not really phase 3. Phase 3 is an example of where we want to be. so that the people that are looking at the gap analysis and seeing the phases and seeing how we want to improve can see where the program's going. We are not necessarily going to keep things set in stone with phase 3. This is just an example of how things are going to mature as we move through the change. So phase 1, again, it's introduction to change. We're suggesting it. We're just doing a couple of simple things. It's not a big deal. Phase 2, we're using the resources more effectively. People are starting to get used to us being in meetings. People are starting to get used to the checkpoints, things like that. Phase 3, it's just where we're going. And then we give all of this to management. So, because this is the kind of language that management understands. This is the kind of thing that they can look at and say, yes, I understand, I agree, we should be doing these things, let's implement this. And they can pass it up to their management, they can pass it up to their management, etc. They can pass it over to other managers and say, this is how it's going to happen. And then people can make changes, they can make suggestions, they can argue, they can do whatever they need to do, but you have to start with something. Because if you start with nothing, then they can't argue, they can't suggest, they can't accept. You have to start with something. So we want to gain management support before we start any of this. And it really helps to have that so that when people argue, we have the backing to say, well, this is how we're doing things now. And these are the people who said that we're doing things this way. And it's not just me going rogue and like making changes. So we show management all of this documentation that we have. We show them where we're going, and then they can talk amongst themselves and do other little political stuff. If you are management, then you can help drive change by supporting your people, by telling them, okay, I'm going to be the champion of this change. I'm going to help you get to where you need to be. I'm going to help deal with all the politics. Those metrics are one thing that can really help influence management. They like to see numbers. They really, really like to see numbers. We also want to talk about like harm to the brand. So this is something that's hard to quantify, but if we can explain that that there are some average industry metrics about how much a breach costs. There are some industry metrics about how much what kind of intangible effects a breach will have. And we need to communicate that and say, we're trying to prevent this. We are the insurance against this happening. And that's what we're trying to sell. So it does cost significantly more to fix, and this is another metric that we can talk about. If you start in the first phase of the SDLC, a problem, a bug, a flaw will cost, let's say, $1 to fix. When we move to the next phase of the SDLC, it will cost 5 times that, 5 to 10 times. As we move to the next phase, 5 to 10 times. So by the time we get to production, it's exponentially more to fix a problem. And if we can communicate that and say, by doing this, by spending the extra hour up front, we are saving dozens of hours in the future fixing the same problem. So if we can catch things earlier, if we can catch security issues that we're going to have problems with later, sooner, it's actually going to save money. And it's hard to quantify that, but that's why we need metrics about what is now, and then we can have metrics about what is in the future. When we plan for change, we need to know who's going to be involved. We need to know who the stakeholders are, what's going to need to change. Are we going to need to spend extra time with the developers? Are we going to need to have more training? Are we going to need to have lunch and learn sessions? Are we going to need to combine, maybe have like a liaison for security that works full-time with the development team? Let's think about the resources that we want to provide and the resources that they're going to need and we're going to need. And we'll talk about why all of these things are important. We'll talk about the cost. We'll talk about the harm to the brand, etc. In order to get stakeholders to participate, we want them to actively participate. So we ask advice of the people that we want involved in the plan. We want them to provide input and own this process with us. If they don't own the process, they won't participate. They won't want it to happen. But if they're part of it and they suggest things and they are, by suggesting things, they're becoming involved. And if that thing that they suggested doesn't work, they look bad. So they want it to succeed. They want it to happen when we get them to actively participate. When they are engaged, they will inevitably support the process in the end because they've had a chance to argue. They've had a chance to provide input. And by the time it gets to the implementation phase of change, they can't argue anymore. They can't say, well, you know, we're not really okay with this. Like, you had months to talk about problems that you had. So they will have to go along with it. It's a little bit of social engineering there. We want the teams to be working together more than they are today. We want developers and security to be working together. We don't just want testing for vulnerabilities after the fact. We're not, when we do like a red team or like a purple team type of thing, we're not addressing the upstream source of the vulnerabilities. We're identifying bugs, we're giving them bugs to fix, but we're not looking at why those bugs are happening. We're not looking at who's making the bugs, how they're getting out without being checked. We need to address those things, and somebody needs to do it, and it's not going to be the red team because their job is just to break. So there needs to be an intermediary between all of these groups so that we can work together through all of the SDLC. We need to not just be looking for known vulnerabilities and exploits and giving them bugs, but we need to actually teach them to code better. So working as a team, we need to partner with them. Like, we come in and we give them these bugs and we audit them and we're like, okay, you did this wrong, you did this wrong. Like, that's not a good way to make friends. That's not a good way to build a relationship. They want to, like, their work to be acknowledged. If you've ever coded anything, like, you know, it's hard work and it's hard to make things do what they're supposed to do. It's hard to make code that does exactly what it's supposed to do. Like, it's not easy. And some people think that code is art. I personally think that code is art. If I was a coder and somebody came in and told me all the things I did wrong with it and didn't give me one thing that I did right, I'd be pretty defensive. So we need to be communicating more. We need to be working together as a team. We need to be talking when we're not policing them. If we do tell them that they did something wrong, we found some bugs, say, okay, well, we were doing a pen test, but we also hit a wall here. Good job. You put that stop there that kept me from going. I had to go around it. Do that again. That's all. I mean, it's just having a more positive attitude when we're dealing with the developers. We shouldn't be like angry at them. We shouldn't be like the people that come in and stomp on everything that they're doing. We should be encouraging them and trying to work with them. So when we do like a red team engagement or we do these offensive testing, that's fine. It's not the end all, and it's not certainly not all we should be doing with software. But we should be having a meeting to talk about what the findings were with management, whoever needs to be involved in the general overview of what was found and what was done and all that. But then we should have another series of meetings with the people who create the software to talk about the things that were found during the red team engagement. If they're just missing patches, it's not a big deal. But if we're finding like buffer overflows and cross-site scripting in web interfaces, then we should be sitting down with the developers and saying, okay, well, why did we find this? Like, do you guys understand what cross-site scripting is? And can we teach you about why this is important and why this shouldn't be here? It's a different kind of mindset than what we're currently doing. We're just giving them the bugs and they fix them and then that's it. But if we can talk to them and say, okay, well, this is what we found and this is what it means. And then they might think to themselves, oh, you know what, I did that somewhere else in another application that was out of scope for testing. Like, maybe I could fix that too next time I'm in there. Or I know somebody else that's doing the same thing. I should tell them about how to do it better. The deeper conversations are really going to lead to them having a better understanding. versus just fixing bugs and moving on. When we talk about a problem, we should talk about the issue, not the people that caused the issue. We're not trying to get personal here. We're not saying, you wrote bad code. We can talk about the code being wrong. It's a little bit different. This is one way that we can depersonalize it a little bit so that we're not attacking the people that are creating the code. And we acknowledge the effort rather than the ability when we talk about these things in a more positive way. It's a good way to build bridges between the two teams who are traditionally somewhat at odds because we have different goals and we have different needs. So we can do what I said. We can say like that. We found this one bug, but there was a mitigation here, and then we found another bug, but the mitigation was perfect, and teach other people to do that, and teach other people to make the code better. One way that we can provide resources is that we can either have embedded liaisons from security where somebody sits with the developers, or one of the developers sits with the red team while they're doing testing, and then they can actually see what the red team is looking for. They can try to build that threat mindset. They can try to think more like an attacker, which is the only way that they're going to really build defenses. When we do this, we also help solidify that same team mindset. And when we have embedded people, when we have rotating work assignments, it's less formal. And when we have like lunch and learns and these kinds of things, it creates more of an environment where people are willing to ask questions. And they're willing to say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this way. What do you think? Rather than having to wait for a meeting and then asking the question. It's easier to just either IM somebody or pick up the phone. I mean, I don't know that anybody does that anymore, but IM somebody or like shout over the cube and just say, hey, I need some help, when it's more informal. So rather than just having like a set weekly meeting or something to talk with security, we need to have a lot more communication between the teams. When we start to make change with software, when we start to embed security into the software process, we need to tell people what we're going to do before we do it. If they are not expecting security as a new thing, they will not be able to allocate time to it. It will shift the master project plan. So we need to make sure that the project managers know what is coming down the line, how long it's going to take approximately, and then they can make sure that when they give that estimated completion date to management, that they come as close as possible to it. Because if we try to shove security in there and they don't make allowances for it, security is going to be the first thing that falls off the table. I mean, they will say, okay, we need this functionality to get it out the door, but sorry, security, you guys didn't tell us that you needed this and didn't give us any time, so you're out. Policy is the best tool that I know of to make change, and not just for software, but anything. If we say we do something in a policy, we have to do it for a number of reasons. One of them is a huge driver, and that's auditors. Auditors will come in and they'll say, okay, show me your policy, and they'll see the statement that says that security reviews all software designs before they go out the door. So they'll say, okay, show me how security reviewed all designs. Show me that security signed off on these designs. The auditors will then be driving that requirement, and it really makes it easier for the rest of the organization to make it happen. When it's in the policy, they can't really say no. They can try to make exceptions and things like that, but at least that's documented, and you can go back and revisit it later. There should be a process for handling exceptions, and it should involve going once a year or something like that, and just going through all the exceptions and saying, do we still need this? Because a lot of times things will have changed, or we can start to have a roadmap for change if they haven't already. So compliance will not say that you need to do anything. other than a few things. They're not going to say that you need to build secure software. That's kind of a problem. So this is why we're using policy to drive that. The PM can allocate the time necessary for the audit and the cost. When we know that we're going that direction, we can build to the spec of the compliance. So if we know that we need to be PCI compliant, we should know that at the beginning of the process. We should know that that we need to have that enclave for data. We know that we need to have encryption. We know that we need to have these things. If we're trying to if we build software and then we go back in and say we need to make it PCI compliant, for example, it's always going to have some problems and it's never going to be exactly how it should be. So determining what the compliance requirements are up front is really important for getting there, basically. If there are new processes, if there are new requirements, we need to make sure that people are trained on those things. Otherwise, they will have a really hard time doing them. If there's a new process for submitting something for approval, that needs to be documented. They need to know how to submit it, where to submit it, who to submit it to. They need to know what comes out of that submission and when they're ready to go to the next phase. So if we're not equipped to talk to others and train others and teach others, then do we need to bring in a third party? Do we need to create like some custom training or some like CBTs or something like that? So we need to think about the needs of the change and how we train people on what the new processes are, on how we're doing things. Let's say that we're going to start using like a style library or something like that with the developers so that they're always doing the same things to make, or using the same libraries or using standard libraries. They need to know where to get the libraries. They need to know which libraries are okay, which ones are not okay. If they're using open source, they need to document it. They just need to know all these things, but giving them a set of requirements is not the same as giving them requirements and then showing them how to meet those requirements. So along those lines, the development style guide is a really, really useful thing, just like policy. So it will force the developers to code in a certain way. It will make it so that it's easy to add security, because it will have been done once. And they will not have to recreate the wheel every time they want to create security. It will address some things like tabs versus spaces, which are kind of not security related, but we can also address things like if you are taking input from a user, you have to do these things to it. So by developing a style guide with security in it, we can make it much simpler for developers to implement security. They were originally used in print. This is just a little fun history for logos and things like that. But a lot of people don't use them for coding. But we should, because developers are going to come in and they're going to have like totally different ideas about how things should be written. And developers don't stay forever. They're going to come, they're going to write some code, they may go to another job, and then somebody has to take over. So knowing that everything's going to be consistent is less of a risk for the business. Automated code scanning is sort of like spell check. It's cool. It's good to have. I highly recommend having it, but you also need to be doing manual code reviews. If you're fully relying on spell check in your document rather than having somebody else read it, I mean, you can see what kind of problems are going to arise there. So making sure that that the manual code reviews are built into the requirements, that the developers have time and are allotted time by their management to do these things is another huge step. Because if we say, okay, you need to do manual code reviews, but you don't get any more time, then that's a problem. Something is not going to happen. Either the code's not going to be good or the code reviews aren't going to happen. So just so that we are all on the same page, a bug is a problem with code and a flaw is a problem with architecture and design. This is one of the reasons why it's so much more expensive to fix things as they go through the SDLC, because flaws in design are much harder to fix. You have to either change hardware, you have to change interactions between software, you have to completely redesign something. And that's not an easy change. So if we understand the difference between a bug, something that's fixable easily, they can just change some code, and when we detect some kind of flaw, or we are preventing some kind of flaw, then that's an important distinction to understand and to be able to express and to be able to explain in terms of risk and problems. One of the suggestions that I have is that we make checklists. I know that's kind of like checklists, whatever. But if we start with the end state where we want to be and we think backwards and we start making checklists of what needs to happen to get to that end state, who was involved, what was approved, how did everything happen to get to the end state, what processes were followed. These are important things that people need to know up front. So we need to give this to people at the start of the life cycle. We need to say, here's what you're going to need to do so that they know, because otherwise it's not going to happen. So we don't usually get to start with SDLC that is pristine and where people are like, yay, security is going to help us with building software. It doesn't usually happen. We can make change, but we have to really understand who is involved, who the stakeholders are. Are they our friends, or are they going to be our enemies? If there are gaps in the process, we need to catalog them, we need to keep track of them, we need to talk about fixes, we need to get that active stakeholder participation so that the fixes can be made and people will adopt any changes. If we can inject security, if we can make the first step that happens with software when there's a change, the first step is that they engage security, that's a huge win for us. That could be through policy, that could be through socialization, however that happens, just getting security involved at the beginning is key. When we fix small things in that phase one type of situation, then we are going to be able to make bigger changes later. So we need to have those small wins up front and phase things in slowly so that people can be more accepting and less uncertain and less uncomfortable with the change. And again, empathy and understanding, say, I know that your goals are to get the software out on time and it should be working and it should be correct, but we need this to happen, so we're going to get you a little more time to make this happen. Just showing that we understand what they are going for is really powerful, because then they will say, okay, well, they do understand what I'm going through, and they won't fight back as much. So this talk is based on something that I wrote for O'Reilly. If you're interested, there's a QR code, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have. Yes? So the question is, with a style guide, who works on that, and then what kinds of things do we include? I would say that it should be a partnership between development and DevOps and anybody that touches code, as well as security should have maybe not like maybe more of an approval input rather than actually writing it. So they'll create the style guide, we'll look at it and say, okay, well, but could you add something about taking input from users, or could you add something about using an API, so that, or could you say that anytime we implement an API, we have two, we have one that's an admin API and one that's a user API. So we can put these things in there that that aren't necessarily like style, like tabs versus spaces, but they are functionality and how things are implemented, so that they have that pattern of, okay, 2 APIs, that's a pattern. They can understand that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Regarding the notion that, there's winners and losers in any project, given the situation where, approval on the initiative depends on potentially the decision happens to be a potential loser in that process, how do you guys stand on how to work through the process?
Sure. So the question is, when you're dealing with somebody who has to approve, but they're going to come out not as much of a winner as other people, or a loser, or they're going to have to take the brunt of some kind of new process or something like that. I would say that it helps to have. That's why part of why having the management and upper level backing helps, so that they can argue with management versus you. I also think that if there really is some significant impact, then the business should determine if the risk is big enough that they need to hire another person, let's say, because they're getting more work or something, then they should be, that's where the risk management program comes in, because they can say, we have a risk that we won't be able to do this new process because we don't have whatever it is. And then the business can decide more formally like how they're going to handle that risk. I also think that if there is if there's resources that security can provide, or some way to automate things, or some way to it may be manual at first, but phase 2 is going to be more automated, or let's say you're going to implement like Archer, or, whatever it is, like some sort of tool to do something, then making sure that they understand that there's a plan to make it easier for them. I understand that it's going to be harder for you, but we're going to work with you up front. We're going to make it easier, and it should be better over time. And eventually they'll just kind of have to accept it. I mean, like, everybody gets to that point where you have more, you think that you're going to have more work than you're going to be able to do, but somehow you make it work because you have to. I hate to say that that's possible, but that is one option. But yeah, I think management buy-in and trying to offer as many cycles as possible to start something and make it happen so that it's easy, because that's usually the hardest part, is just getting it started. Other questions? Yes.
Another question or a comment. Your biggest thing about turnover rate for programmers now, it's not even just that. You're on a project for 9 months, 2 years. What you wrote 2 years ago, you're not going to remember what you wrote very well unless you do some sort of style guide stuff. And worse yet, you pick it up from somebody else on your team. If they crunched it all together like you used to do for GW Basic and that, it's a pain to figure it out.
Yeah, that is so true. Yeah, I mean, the style guide and things like that, and documentation is key when you have software, because, I mean, I've written code and I've gone back in like a couple months later and been like, what is this supposed to do? And you're almost doing forensic coding at that point, which is kind of weird, but, yeah, like that's why the documentation is so important. But if they don't have the time to create that documentation, if they don't have that resource available to them, their management doesn't think that documentation is important, they're not going to do it. So it all starts at the top. It all starts with buy-in and support from the people who say, I see this code that you wrote, that's great, but where's the documentation? That's going to make a difference between having it and not having it. Because if management doesn't care, you can bet the engineers don't care. Other questions? Yes?
Any recommended resources for starting or frameworks or checking security in this?
Any resources I can suggest? So you can so Microsoft has a really good program with the SDL, but it's extremely formal. And it may be too formal for like a lot of smaller shops and things like that. The thing that I wrote for O'Reilly is exactly this. It's exactly about injecting security. It's fixing that insecure software lifecycle. I mean, that's literally what it was about, because there really isn't a great resource, or there wasn't a great resource about how to do that, how to go in and observe and figure out what needs to change and make changes and things like that. So that's why they asked me to write this, because I don't have any other better resources, really. Yes? To fix what in requirements and design? Right.
And for that we have 45 tools like in development. But I do see in your slides that there is a possibly requirements and design. You know what's the solution?
So the question is about how to automate and make it easier and more standard as you go from design phase before you get into development. I think one thing that I did was I took some existing questionnaires like the CAIQ from Cloud Security Alliance and the CC, I forget what it's called. There's another one that they have. It's just like a huge spreadsheet with requirements to meet compliance. But if you look at it a different way, and you look at the requirement as a test, as a user story. So the requirement is that you need to use encryption for sensitive data in transit and at rest. So you turn that into a user story. And you can have reusable user stories. You can have checklists for design, and it can say if there is a component that touches another component, it needs to be in a DMZ checkbox. You can turn them into checklists. Not every part of a checklist that you create like that is going to apply to every, let's say, I work for a big company, so I see all kinds of different things. They're not always software, they're not always appliances. They're sometimes on-prem, they're sometimes hybrid. So not everything in a checklist may apply, but the checklist is the automation for requirements and design, making sure that somebody knowledgeable from security is looking at those things and helping to design it and approving it before it goes to the next phase. But you can take any set of requirements from compliance and turn it into a user story, but it has to be testable. So if let's say that you need to have encryption at rest, then you need to have a testable statement for the user story that allows QA or DevOps or whoever's doing this down the line to test that the user story that was provided before development started exists. Because if it's not testable, then there's no way, yeah. So yeah, checklists are really the best thing. I don't know of any specific tools that can look at an architecture and say that it's not secure. If anybody knows of any, I'd love to hear about it. But I don't know of anything other than knowledgeable people that can look at an architecture and say, okay, well, there's not enough redundancy here, or there's you have too many ports open, or we should separate this service into two machines or two clusters or whatever. And it's more analysis that humans do. I don't know of any tools that can do it, unfortunately. Questions? We have a minute left. Okay, yes? So the question is, how do we do this in an agile, a more frequent release cycle? And the answer is, this is why we need developers to be the front line of defense, because we cannot keep up with that. There's no way that we could do offensive testing on a weekly basis for a piece of software. It's just impossible. I mean, it's literally impossible. So we have to make sure that the developers are trained, that they're able to reach out and communicate and talk about things that they're doing in real time so that they can avoid mistakes later. If that involves getting cross-training or having developers sit with the red team or sit with the blue team or whatever it takes, they have to be the ones that we're relying on for security. And that's why it's so critical and it's so crazy that they're not trained in security as they go, because we are in that agile life cycle. I mean, like we just can't rely on security. It's just impossible. So if we can train the developers, if we can impart why security is important, that's why we have those extra meetings when we talk about red team findings, and we can talk with the blue team, and we can talk about like what kind of logs should it provide, and should it do extra introspection when something's detected, and just having those dialogues and having them understand the security side and knowledge